First, thanks for organizing this wonderful meeting. It's really great for me to be able to meet a lot of people that I've known for many years from their papers and never had the chance to really talk to them. And this is an excellent setting for that. Hopefully, we'll bring collaborations and creative stuff like that. So this is the title of my talk today. I want to sort of review some of the things, overview some of the things that we have been doing over the past few years, which I think are very relevant to the topic of this workshop, and touches different aspects of it, like creativity, innovation, complexity, all things that have to do with the deeper structure and complexity that we find in language. And first, I will present it in two different parts that have an underlying theme, but they present different approaches to understand or gain insights from language. First of all, I want to thank my friend, lifelong friend and collaborator, Damian Zanette, who essentially is my partner in all these language studies. Because my main professional focus is in Manchester is not necessarily language, but more internal neural activity. So I study neural information processing as my main job, and this is something I keep very close to it because it has some similarities for me in terms of the complexities and rich information content one can actually extract from language or from neural information, neural signals. But this is something that I have been doing essentially with my friend Damian. So I was saying that the big outline of the big partition of the talk, we have these two different parts. In both of them, we are going to try to quantify or kind of measure the delicate balance that one has in language between order and disorder. So between this predictability and innovation that we have. And of course, it's not only a feature of language, but also it's a feature of other complex information carriers that we find in nature. There are not many of them, but language is one. We have genetic information as the other complex information carrier, and also neural activity in the brain can be taken as such, and also we find it features a balance between order and disorder. So just to review some of the things that may be quite obvious for people here, language is, as we said, one of the very few natural complex information carriers that we know. It is subject to the constraints which put it somewhere between order and disorder sequences. And we will see that trying to measure that will allow us to have some insights into the structure of language, trying to measure where the balance exactly is. Another thing that I mentioned is a strong feature of language is the fact that it's a very high dimensional object, which is mapped or projected into one-dimensional sequence, and that imposes also another level of structure that we can see in the presence of these long-range correlations I have mentioned a few times here. So one of the first questions, I mean, put in a general way, so I will in my work I will address a kind of more constrained scope of the question, but the big question is how the statistical order in these linguistic sequences relates to the semantic information and content. That has been a kind of a question I've had for many years. So is it possible to link statistical structure, ordering language, or the balance between order and disorder, and the purpose of language, which is also convey meaningful information between humans? So that's one of the questions that I want to address or start addressing, to show what we have been doing about that. And the second one has to be with the diversity of language, of languages. As you pointed out yesterday, we have language and languages. But in the world we have now around 8,000 languages being spoken, and of course probably in the past there were many more. The more we become globalized, the more we approach to globish, as was mentioned, the fewer languages we will have. All these languages are distributed into big families that have relationship between them. But now we have another observation, and this is the evolution. So what were the processes that took language to this scenario of diversity with some commonalities and some very, very, very divergent cases? And already it was pointed out by Darwin and also people before him, that language, the evolution of a species and the language trees and one could make have certain similarities. And the similarities among them are more than superficial. So language evolves in the process of competition, information exchange, etc., which has certain parallels with biological evolution. So people have been asking for many decades, or more than that. So if among these diversity of languages there were commonalities, universals, and that can be addressed at many different levels. So I'm not a linguist, so I will address it as a kind of down-to-earth empirical level of referring to a statistical quantitative universals. So things are statistically consistent across languages and shared by many of them. And we have been, in the previous talk and yesterday as well, discussing some of the things, the principle of Zipf's law, the exponents, Heat's law, etc. They have some statistical universality in a sense. But here we are concentrating in this balance between order and disorder. So that will become specific when we get to that point. So in the first part I want to get to the problem of trying to address the question of meaning in the restricted sense and a statistical structure in language. Going back a bit to the question of the different ranges of order, different levels of structure. This is not a linguistic classification, but it's something that comes from trying to analyze or quantify the statistical structure in language. So we have a structure that comes from the word forms, and then word frequencies, and then you have constraint imposed by grammar, which dictates how you can mix those words inside sentences, and then you have a long-range constraint that also starts to act at sentence level, like grammar, which is semantic. So individual sentences have semantic content, but also have a kind of macroscopic, long-range semantic order, which imposes, for example, which they can take you to topicality. So the structure of topicality along many, even hundreds of sentences, where the statistical shape of the words you use is imposed by this topicality. So different levels of the hierarchy can be quantified. So at some point, we would like to make a link between the statistics and semantics. And the observation, the starting point for this is something that Eduardo was talking the previous talk. It has to do with the patterns in which certain words appear. That has maybe observation made by some people in terms of burstiness, and quantified also looked by Fumiko, Giampaolo, and Eduardo in their papers. When we started looking at this, it was more or less by the time, yes, actually you submitted your paper, we thought, we didn't think about the word burstiness, but we thought about the word domains. We looked at words, for example, this is an example from The Origin of Species of Charles Darwin. We have more or less 150,000 words in the sequence. And see, you see these burst plots where the position of the word is so that the local rate of the word is signaled by these spikes. So this is taken, for example, for the word plants in The Origin of Species. You see that there are regions where I have strongly used of the word plants, of course, when you talk about plants, but then there are gaps, silence, quiescent periods when you don't mention the word plants. And there are other examples, for example, the word instinct is very interesting. It's mentioned at the middle of the book in a kind of big burst, essentially not mentioned elsewhere except a bit at the end. While other words, like for example, the preposition for is used with the density. Of course, it has fluctuations, but it's more or less used throughout the text. So this has been observed, and the idea is related to the idea of topicality. So the question was, since these content-bearing words have this particular distribution, which is characterized by the presence of domains or bastions, so what can we do to actually capture that in a measure that, in a principled way, connects statistics and meaning in the sense of content-bearing words? So we proposed a simple scenario for this, which was, we imagined that a text was divided in certain boxes, in P boxes, have text from word 1 to word n, and we divided in P boxes of equal size. And then you asked how good each word, in a statistical sense, each word, how good a tag is for these boxes. So what I mean is, intuitively, if you have a word that appears only in one box, that's a perfect tag. So I know if I find that word, I'm at that part of the text. Okay? A word that appears with a flat distribution throughout the text will not be a tag for any of the parts, because I don't know in which part I am if I find that word. Yeah? So that concept, which is very simple, is captured by this probability. So of course I can measure the frequencies of all the words inside these parts. Essentially the word of the parts are indexed by J, so the probability of finding the word W, whatever it is, at part J will be given by this ratio of word counts. But the probability I'm interested in is the inverted one. So what's the probability of being at part J given that I found word W? So that's essentially a report of how good the tag that word was in terms of probability. But what we do with that probability? We can use that probability to actually measure an information. We can measure the information that the distribution of words, of that word, gives me about the partition of the text, how informative it is. So we can essentially calculate Shannon information for that word distribution, word probabilities. Essentially, we compute the mutual information between the words and the partition of the text, so the boxes. Essentially, what we are measuring is how much informative word distribution is about the specific partition of the text. If all words appear, of course, uniformly, there will be no information, and that information should be 0. One can briefly just rearrange this, and then this information becomes a difference of two entropies. One is the entropy of the partition, which is always the same, this log p, and the other is an entropy that has to do with that probability that gives you the probability of being at a particular partition, a part of the text, given that you found word W, which is this. Just because we will need later, this can be simplified or written in this form where you have a weight given by the frequency of the word in the overall text, and then this other entropy quantity, which is an entropy computed for specific words. So that will be an important thing later. So it's an entropy for every individual word, while this is an average over all the vocabulary. The vocabulary is K, so the sums go over the whole vocabulary. Ideally, for this to work, we would like it to report 0 information for a random word, so whether it appears uniformly. Yeah? But that's not the case. If we, an ideal word that is distributed homogeneously throughout the text will appear always in every part with probability 1 over p. So if one were to compute these entropies, we'll give log p. If this gives you log p, we have log p minus log p, that should be 0. Yeah? But in practice, you will never get log p for a random word because of a sampling problem. Because you never have that many words. So words usually are all undersampled, in the sense that even a random word will have statistical fluctuations that will make its entropy lower than the maximum, the entropy you would obtain for a word that appears an infinite number of times. We will see that later. So I will show you how it works. So let's take a concrete example. Again, let's go to Darwin's book. And let's plot the following thing. So we compute for every word in the text different entropy quantities. The first one is the entropy that I mentioned before, the entropy per word in the real text. You compute simply just by counting the words over a given partition. Then here I'm using P equals 64. I will clarify why later. And then you plot the entropy of the word versus this frequency for all words. Yeah, and you find this blue cloud of blue points here for this entropy. But also we compute the entropy for the shuffled text. So we destroy the ordering text by shuffling all the words. So essentially the words become uniformly distributed, as uniform as they can be given the number they appear. So that's what we get, where we get these yellow points. Of course, they are more concentrated, you still have fluctuations, and systematically they have kind of higher entropy there on the upper part. Yeah. That random entropy, we can, entropy for the random words, we can estimate it analytically as well, which is this black line. So this is the average over an infinite number of shuffling of the text. Yeah. So what we find is that, when you shuffle the text, when you destroy the linguistic order, the entropy of the words increases, which is reasonable. So the entropy of the real word is lower. Yeah? And it's lower because of the linguistic constraints. It was not randomly distributed, but it has a particular pattern of occurrence given by linguistic constraints. What I was saying is that you see that even the random text, so one would expect for very frequent words, like the top ones, like the article, the, for example, some prepositions, you get that the entropy of random words gets to the expected log p value. But for words that do not appear so frequently, which are most of the words, the value is not the maximum value. So that's what I was saying. Even random words will not have the maximum expected entropy because of the fluctuations. Okay, so that gives you an idea. That gives you an idea that since we realize that these lower entropy because of the linguistic constraints, we can use the difference between the expected random, the word of the entropy of the random word compared to the real one as a measure of its linguistic order. So essentially, the measure that we proposed is a difference of mutual informations. So you have the mutual information computed for the real words, and now we subtract the residual mutual information that you would find even for the random words because of sampling problems. Yeah. So this difference should have, if we are right, some information about the linguistic order in the words. Yeah. So by just manipulating a bit how we write the things, we get to this quantity. So this first we call it delta I as a function of S. S here is the size of the box, is the scale, so the partition, everything will be a function of the partition here. We decide, we'll see how we choose the partition later. But the interesting thing is that after this simple manipulation, this information can be written as this sum. A sum that goes over the whole vocabulary. So you go from word 1 to word k, k is the size of the vocabulary, and then inside it there's a very simple mathematical structure. The thing you have here is the frequency of the word. So how frequent it is. So let's say that contributes to the information. So the more frequent a word is, the most will tend to contribute to this information. But the other part is the part that talks about the balance between order and disorder, because it's a difference between the actual entropy and the entropy that the word would have if it was randomly distributed. So it tells you a bit a measure about the order in the sequence of that particular word. And the sum goes over words. So you can see that each word has a precise contribution to the information. The useful thing of this, for me, is that it can tell you which words are contributing the most to this measure of information. Yeah. If you go back for a bit and remember how we define this information, was defined as answering the question how good a tag a word is for different partition of the text. And it tells you something here that the more heterogeneous distribution, the better tag it is. And we realize that. But the other is have to be frequent. So I have to have these two things. Highly heterogeneous distribution, highly frequent. That will be a word that contributes more to this information, which is clear. If one goes back to the first the empirical methods of information retrieval, that's very consistent with it. Because, if you go to the earlier papers in the 70s, for example, of method for finding relevant terms in a series of documents, so they were pragmatic, and they were said, yes, a word will be relevant to classify documents if it's partially distributed, so it's heterogeneous among documents, but also has to be frequent. And that was came out of the practical empirical estimation. And here is appearing naturally because of the way we ask the information to be. So what we ask the information to measure, which is how the tag information a word is. So it appears exactly the same. So a word to contribute to the information has to be frequent and has to have a heterogeneous distribution. Yes. So before analyzing specifically that fact of which are the words that contribute the most, let's look at how the quantity varies with the scale, because I don't know how to choose the partition yet. So the observation is here a few example for three books from these three people, is that it has a maximum, it is an optimal value. So there is plotting everything as a function of the scale, so that's the total information, that the sum of all, the result of all of this sum, over different values of the scale for the different books. We find that it peaks clearly at a certain value, which is here in a range of, let's say, 700 to probably 2,000 words. And going back to the definition, that partition is the one that creates the highest heterogeneity in the distribution of words. So the distribution of entropy, the information goes down at both extremes and peaks at a given value. So that tells you something, that these are the specific partition, the maximized information, and the one we can choose. By choosing that partition, the one that maximizes information, now we can look what are the words that contribute the most to this information. Because there is a clear way of assigning different weights to these words. So we can talk about the information per word, or the contribution to the information per word. If you do that for these three example books, you get to this ranking of words, and clearly these words are the words that are not their words, but our words are closely linked to the semantic content of these books. So the words that are more informative in the sense of being highly heterogeneous and also frequent tend to be the words that you would use as keywords to identify the topic of these words. Of course, there are certain call it outliers or noise effects, because there are some words which are not topical or content words. But these words that appear here, for example, let's take the article in the origin of the species. It's a definition which is position 19, something like that. They appears 10,000 times in the origin of the species. But hybrids appears only 138 times. But hybrids is close to the top. Yes. So although the enormous frequency of D can push by some fluctuation the word to this rank, still a word like hybrids that has much lower frequency, almost 2 orders of magnitude less, but a much larger heterogeneity, is saying that hybrids is a more topical word than the, which is what one would agree. Okay, so we apply this method to a large database. So we have been listening to talks, analysis done on bigger databases, but at the time I was our big database. So 5,000 books that we got from Project Gutenberg. And what we did was to compute the maximum of information for all these texts. So essentially, this is the distribution for the whole database. So it peaks at 0.2 bits per word and seems to be a very well-defined quantity. You can also, I don't know whether it can be clearly seen, discriminate how these all the information in this sense is what value it has for books of different types. So you can see for literature is around here. It's light blue, can be seen. Then history, similar to literature, has information around 0.15, less than 0.2. But then we have books about science topics, or engineering. It has a kind of larger information values in this sense. And that can be understood why, for example, scientific and engineering books have larger information values, because in the sense we define information has to do with the more strongly topical the different sections are, you have higher values of information. If all the words are topical, you have a maximum information value. And usually scientific books and engineering technical books have kind of more clear divisions, thematic divisions in them, and that's captured by the measure. The other thing that the measure had was the presence of this scale. The scale that appeared around between 1,000 and 2,000 words where the information was maximum. So when you measure that, and against it cannot be clearly seen, but we have the cloud of points here for all the 5,000 books, where we have the length of the book, length of the text, and the scale at which the information peaks. You see there is growth, so the longer the book is expected, the longer this scale, but it grows in a sublinear way. So the length of the book grows faster than this scale. We have some evidence, or anecdotal evidence, to relate this scale to the scale of the semantic domains where topics are developed. So topics need a number of words to develop, where you use a certain cluster of words related to a topic. And we thought that this scale relates to that. By looking at examples, one can pick a specific point and look at what book, what text it is. By looking at these examples, that idea seems to be consistent. I'm not saying that we are demonstrating that, but if you take, for example, books which are in this range, where we have a very, very small scale of around, say, around 50 words, 60 words, you find books like this, which are books about recipes or books about quotations. So where you have a series of sentences that are very short, have very narrow semantic topical range for different parts. And then if you go here, you get these huge monothematic books like the independent volumes of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, which is here, is one of the ones that has the longest scale. And that's understandable that this is part of an encyclopedia of 6 volumes, and each of them talks about one topic, which is the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And you find that that's consistent. When we thought about this domain,
sorry, just a clarification. So what you're plotting on the y-axis is the peak.
The peak, yes, where the scale at which you have maximum information.
Okay.
Yes. So in our view of domains, so we said each word, especially content words, have a specific domain in which they tend to occur, typical domain structure. We propose a very simple model, which was that a word will appear with a kind of background probability throughout the text, except in a given domain of size L, where it will occur with a higher probability. So that will be our, in our view, our domain. So we can, using the same estimation of information, so the information from this model word, And what we see is that we can fit. So you have here the information in points, information for the real word as a function of the scale for individual words, using the contribution of each word to the information. And we can fit, using the model, the behavior of the real word. And interestingly, what comes out of this is that the size of the domain is typically the scale at which you have the maximum of the information. So this information is peaking at the particular domain size for that particular word. So words that have essentially very short domains, like the prepositions and non-content words, have a peak where at a very low scale. But words like plants or instinct have a peak at a scale of around a few thousand words. Yeah? So that was a simple model. So a real word will appear in more than one domain, but the idea is captured in the sense that the domain structure, the size where the domain the word tends to occur, gives you a sense of the scale at which the information has a maximum. That's why we can interpret that when you take the overall text, it will tell you the maximum, it will tell you something about the typical average domain structure of the words, which necessarily will be linked to the size of the topical domain. So what are the ranges in the scale where words are used consistently to address one specific topic. So since we can use these to extract keywords, which are content-bearing, what content-bearing words, we can also try to see what are the relationships between them. So once we have them, we can use a very simple word space method, where we can identify words like vectors over the different parts, and we can see how similar these vectors are, how different they are. In fact, we can construct proximity networks of these words in this space. And here we are not doing any dimensionality reduction. We are not using methods like latent semantic indexes or anything like that, because we already picked the words with the strongest signal. So if we take these keywords, or the words that run to the top on the information contribution, we just describe them as vectors and analyze the distance with a simple cosine distance between the words, and we get immediately these sort of semantic networks from a text. So this is again the example of the origin of the species. Essentially, we didn't know anything about that except the identification of words. I didn't do any stemming or any dimensionality reduction or anything. Just pick the words, describe the words as vectors, and analyze which are the words that are more closer to each other. You find, if you can read that all these little clusters are semantically related. So
sorry, Marcelo, can you go back? I didn't understand.
Sorry.
So you pick up the keyword using the entropy?
I pick up the keywords. So each keyword now can be described as a vector of dimension p.
Is the relative frequency in each section?
Yes, in each section. So
okay.
it's a vector, each word is a vector of p dimensions. I normalize that vector and then analyze the distances, the cosine distance between vectors. Yeah? And simply with that, I get these semantic networks. So essentially, without only knowing which are the words, how to identify the words in the text, I was able to extract some semantic structure in it. So I said, okay, these are words that are semantically connected, and in fact they are. So we have islands, oceanic Galapagos, bees, hive, bee, cell, cells, con, walks. So these are essentially words that are glacial, northern, temperate, southern, tropical. So these are have to be to climate, geography. Yes. So of course there are maybe even more efficient methods, but this is austere in the sense that it doesn't have to put in much information except what is the word. So this was tested in, of course, it works for other languages because this versatile feature is not just a feature of English. And we recently applied this to, which is a kind of nice test for this, which is a completely undeciphered language, which was which is Voynich manuscript. This probably you know about his manuscript, which has has defined buffer cryptology for more than 80 years. It is written in a known script. People are still debating whether it is a language, whether it is a fake, or what is it. The image is not very well, but the book is fully illustrated with strange figures of plants, women having baths in strange green liquids, yes, pharmacological artifacts. So it seems to be about alchemy, but no one is sure even that it says something. Okay, I can't go into the details, so we have a paper on that. But I think you also did something of that at the same time, arriving at similar conclusions, which is interesting. Essentially, well, just what I want to keep the analysis, but essentially we came up with some similar thing as we saw for the origin of the species, which is a sort of putative semantic networks. I'm not trying to say that this is the solution of the point in manuscript, but at least these are statistically significant features that we extracted based on some principal method that can extract words that in a real text would be semantically related. Interesting in the case of the Voynich, which seems to appear, is that words that form these clusters of possibly semantically related words are also morphologically similar. That's a feature that we didn't know. So as you see, these are transliterations of the script of the Voynich. But you see that they share similar symbols. They say shedi, kedi, so these are similar roots, similar endings. You see here short, chor, chol, shol. So they have a structural, morphological similarity, but also seem to be semantically related. Yeah. Okay. One can expand on that and use that as an argument that there may be something into the Voynich. That was our conclusion. But just keeping that. So the useful thing about this is to go back a bit. Is that we proposed a very simple thing to quantify or to use the interplay between order and disorder in language to extract information about its meaning content. We are trying to define meaning. I'm not defining meaning, I'm using it in a pragmatic way. So meaning in the sense of extracting topical words from the text. And it only requires minimal knowledge of the language structure. That's another advantage. So in the second part, how was the time?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. That's not bad. So the second part, I want to show another approach to quantify this balance between order and disorder. So previously, we essentially distributed the word in boxes. So we look essentially at the rates at which words appear, but we never took into account explicitly the correlations in language. Whatever entropy estimation that decides to address the presence of correlations is, or any direct method to estimate the entropy is doomed to failure, because the size of sample space grows exponentially with the number of characters or words that you add. Becomes any real source you have is statistically insignificant to estimate this entropy. So the only way we have to do it is to use compression methods, which use a completely different way to make entropy estimations, but are highly effective. So one can show in information theory that the entropy of a stochastic sequence is a lower bound for the size of any compressed version of the sequence. Yeah? So having a universal compressor which is effective then can give you a way to estimate this entropy. So essentially, we decided to now make these entropy estimations based using these compression algorithms. With the advantage that now we can take into account all the correlation structure of language. We're not looking at rates of words appearing or words occurring, but we will look at the whole order in the structure. Yeah. So essentially, if you want to estimate this, So on the one hand, you have to pick one compression method. I will not discuss the topic. We didn't use any of the standard methods or compression algorithm per se, but we use algorithms that estimate the entropy using ideas from compression algorithms. So essentially estimating the entropy is easier than compressing a text, and you can get more accurate measurements. So these algorithms, especially we use the one developed by Contoyanis, estimates the entropy using compression algorithms, but without compressing the text. So we don't compress the texts. The details are there, so that would be too complicated to describe. And that would give us an entropy of the full sequence. So we can use this estimation, compression methods, have an estimation of the entropy. But also we wanted to compare, because we want to assess this level of order, we need something to compare with. And the thing to compare with was the disordered text. So a text where we know we destroyed all the linguistic structure. And again, this is just obtained by shuffling the text.
Shuffling on words?
Shuffle on words level, yes.
Because compressor does not see words. Oh, okay.
No, well, our compression sees words, only words. So these compressors are words at word level,
okay,
not at character level.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is another detail of the method, but it's good. So we first recode the text in a way that there's no information below word level. So word level is the minimum information, minimum level information we have. So we don't have word structure here, or word form. So each word has a different index. So we first compute this, and the other entropy we compute is the entropy that has no linguistic order. So we mix all the words, and then you can estimate how many ways of shuffling the text you have. Then you can estimate the entropy, that's taking the logarithm of all those number of words. Yeah. So we can get a measure again, a measure that is a difference between order and disorder. We'll have something about the linguistic structure, but the difference is now we are using the full order in language when we estimate this entropy. Yeah? Or we simply take the difference. So the entropy, the stochastic, the random entropy will be larger, so we have something which will be bigger, larger than 0. So just to say something briefly, make a connection which is a bit formal, but it's useful to interpret, at least to give a name to what we found, is that this entropy that we simply calculated estimating the logarithm of the number of possibilities when you shuffle text, the number of different shuffling texts, for very long texts can also be computed as the entropy of the zip distribution. Yes? Because that mathematically happens in the thermodynamic limit when you have an infinite number of words, but in practice it happens for the typical length of text, as we will see. The usefulness of writing this entropy, the random entropy, as the entropy of the zip distribution, where we only have the frequency of words and no linguistic order, just frequencies, is that when we compute the difference now, that we computed earlier, now that difference is formally the Kullback-Leibler divergence in information theory, which is a very well characterized measure, divergence in language. So essentially, our measure that we defined before as the difference between two entropies, or the one using this ZIPS distribution, are essentially the same. We will see that. Even if we don't have infinite text for normal size text. Okay, so where we apply these things? So,
sorry, Marcelo, why not compressing also the shuffle text?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was expecting that.
No, because I mean, for infinite text, I mean, I agree. I mean,
yes.
But I mean, in practice, this is.
Well, in practice, there is a problem of convergence. So these compression algorithms.
Anyway, are you using level zip or?
Well, I'm using level zip, based on level zip.
Okay, but this convergence, I mean.
Well, it takes longer to converge.
Yeah,
much longer to converge. So in a sense, we tested, so everything you will see here, so we tested that we were converging for the text, so that we computed the entropy in the full text and also in half of the text, and asked the entropy, the two entropies, to be within a narrow percentage. Yeah. The problem with estimating the entropy of the random sequence, also by compression, is that we need longer text because it's much slower. So we decided, it seems, that should be the conversion asymptote, the analytic estimation. We decided to use that directly.
Yeah, but no, I would say, more consistent to use the same compression techniques for the original text and the shuffle, because then all the finite size effect would be more or less, on the same
yes.
order of magnitude.
Well, we have to discuss that. So
Okay,
that's for me. I think
it's
it's much more biased,
Yeah.
the estimation of the random text than the order one. So yes, well, that's why we discussed it. We can discuss it later, but that's the problem. I would agree, and in some applications it's a very good, useful thing, what Vittorio said, that you have two measures that have bias, both of them have bias, but the biases are of equal size. If you take the difference, you have essentially a non-biased measure. But specifically, that was the point. And specifically, we decided not to use it because of that, because the biases for us are not the same. So we decided to use a slightly biased one and a completely unbiased one. At least that was the best we could do. Okay, so we decided to apply that also to estimate this measure of linguistic order between these two entropies over a number of different texts in different languages. So we tried to pick things from different linguistic families to make things as diverse as we could. Again, we resorted to the database we had at the moment, which was Gutenberg project, and we got all these texts, 7,000 texts from 6 linguistic families. Also looked at some sites for more esoteric examples, like transliterations of Egyptian hieroglyphs and transliteration of cuneiform writing from Sumerian tablets. Yeah, but then we have all languages from extant families. And the interesting thing for us was to see whether we could find some consistency or what was the difference between this linguistic order. Because you can estimate, and there are many papers, many studies of the entropy of language itself, but the entropy of language, of different languages, is different, because languages have, of course, different syntax, different vocabulary sizes, it's fine, and so the entropy is a quantity which is not necessarily universal across languages. But then we ask, is there something that probably captures more of the commonality of languages? So we decided to look at this order, linguistic order, where we subtract essentially, as we will see, features that have to do with vocabulary size or inflection structure, etc. by subtracting the random entropy. So the interesting thing about this database also is that it contains, of course, many of these languages have common origins, but they have been diverging for quite some time, and there are studies that have been recently using principal methods to put numbers to using cladistic methods when these divergence started. So you have more or less 9,000 years for the Indo-European family, but you can also trace the split between the Finno-Ugric languages and the Indo-European to almost 15,000 years. So they have been separated language for quite some time. So if we find some commonalities, then we have to ask why do we have them? Yeah, we come to that. So we first, I show briefly some estimation of these quantities for some example languages. So here is the estimation of the entropy of the random text for these databases, Chinese, English, and Finnish. You see the values of the random entropy, but Finnish are larger. Finnish is the highly inflected language, so the entropy of the random distribution is driven heavily by this high vocabulary, effective vocabulary size. And then you have the entropy of the order sequence, which is less, typically less in all examples. And of course, one would like to see the difference between these two, which is the red distribution. And you see two interesting things. So I will not discuss in detail both rows. One is the first estimation with the entropy à la Boltzmann, and the second is estimation with the random entropy à la Zipf. So they are essentially the same, so text size is not a problem. That's the message. But let's look at the distribution of the difference of this measure of order, linguistic order. Interestingly, they all seem to be consistent, more or less, even we finish with a much higher entropy than the others, but this one seems to be more or less just one eye, at the same position. That's one feature. And the other feature is that, for example, is clearly seen in English, which is our largest database, it is much narrower. So the differences among the different samples in the database in this linguistic order is much less than the raw difference in the entropy. So it's much more consistent. Okay, so we applied this to all the languages we had, and we got to this result. So here we have, for all the languages in our database, so we have an estimation of the entropy of the random text. You see how it varies depending on the structure of the language. This is the entropy of the ordered sequence for all the languages, which also fluctuates between more than 6 bits or 6 or 7 bits for Finnish to low values like less than 4 bits for Sumerian. Okay, but then if you look at the difference, so the measure of this linguistic order that we said, the difference between these two entropies, has much less variability. Is constrained in all the examples we have in the band around 3.3, 3 point something, and 3.5 bits. Yeah, it seems to be highly conserved in all the examples. So in principle, you can continue to apply this. This is a recurrent thing, so this is quite diverse. We also apply it to Spanish, and we get the same thing without surprise. It's also in the European language, Latin as well. So the question is, what's the meaning of this? So remember that this measure that seems to be constant across these linguistic families can be related to a Kullback divergence. So, but what's the meaning of this? So a constant measure. So it's a measure of linguistic order. Why is it the same across all these languages? So we approach this. We have 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I will not go into the details. In 2 ways. So we first did a modal analysis, a very simple model. So we did a minimalist language. So it has only 2 words. So it's very simple to analyze. And it can be solved analytically because all the structure of the grammar is inside a 2 times 2 matrix. Yeah? So that's good. But the good thing is that we can compute everything analytically. We can compute the correlation length, the typical correlation length, because correlations here will be exponential in this Markovian language. And we also can compute the rate at which each of these words appear. And in fact, we can describe the model by these parameters, the rate of occurrence of each word and the correlation length. So we did something that's a bit more complicated, like, once we have that, also everything can be computed analytically, also the measure D, which is the measure of linguistic order in this language. It's very simple to do, to compute the entropy of the Markov process. So we have a measure of these, and we can write this measure, the measure of linguistic order, as a function of the correlation length and the rate of words. That's the useful thing. The next thing, and I will mention less detail, is not 2-word but K-word model. So more than 2 words. Yeah. So it can be generalized. Of course, things get a bit more tricky analytically, but we can still get some estimation of the correlation length as the size of the second eigenvalue of the transition matrix in the Markov process. So essentially that, and we can also compute the entropies in a simple way. So we can estimate simply this quantity D, that tells you something about the linguistic order in this model. Okay, so we apply this to these toy languages. Yeah. So I have a 2-word Markov and a 4-word Markov. It is hard to go higher than 4 because to get something visible, you need to do many iterations of this. It's very difficult to sample things. What I'm showing here is the correlation. Here's the correlation length of the model versus the entropy of the random distribution, the random text. Yeah. What you see here are the lines are the ISO-KL lines. So these are lines of constant Kullback value difference. Yeah? Remember that we found that for all these languages, real languages, there would seem to be constant KL distance. because I have leverage diversions. So that would be that all the languages were along one of these iso-KL lines. Yeah? But what do they mean? They mean the following. It means that to be always along one of these lines, if you have more symbol diversity, let's say the entropy of the random text is larger, you need to have less correlation. And on the contrary, if the entropy of the random text is smaller, you need to have more correlation, longer correlation lengths. Yeah? That's the way in which you can move along one of these lines. If you're constrained to move on one of these lines, there's a trade-off. Either you have more entropy in the random text, which is more vocabulary diversity, effective vocabulary diversity, or you have more correlation. One thing balances the other, at least in the model. So we would like to see how that works in the real languages. The real languages are more difficult because correlations are power laws. So we cannot measure, we don't have a correlation length, we have many length scales at the same time. But we can measure, yesterday Theo described the trend fluctuation analysis, we can get an estimate of how slowly these correlations decay in real language by estimating an exponent alpha that comes from the trend fluctuation analysis, as Theo explained, and that can be related to the exponent at which the power law correlations decay. Yeah? So essentially, the larger the scale exponent alpha, the slower the correlations decay. So the longer the effective range up to you can feel the correlations. So what we did, just to end, is to pick the most significant, the larger databases we had, for which we have more significant clear distributions, and plotted the average value of the exponent you get from the DFA. So we computed the trend fluctuation analysis for all the text in the databases, obtained the mean value, which is the mean value of these distributions, and plotted it here for these languages, at the end, and the entropy, the mean entropy of the random text for those databases. And clearly, there is a clear tendency of the language to align in a way which is not too different to the ones we saw there, especially if you look carefully which languages they are. So you have here English, yes, which has a smaller entropy of the random text, but has a kind of longer range in its correlation structure. As you increase the inflection structure of the language, you have more entropy for random text in French, more inflection in French, and then less level of correlation. And then one step more with German, and finally the largest gap is with Finnish. You have much more entropy, larger entropy in the random text, and even less correlation range. Okay? So, it seems to be that if this is real, of course, it is more kind of a question put than an answer, because it needs further investigation. That this is true, that across language evolution, if you have, when languages evolve, if they develop more inflection structure, somehow you have a decrease in the correlation length, which seems to be constrained within a narrow value for the balance between order and disorder given by the scale distance of 3.5 bits. So it seems to be this constant, and then you have a trade-off. Why that is happening, if this is true, probably that's a constraint that has to do with the cognitive balance, the cognitive optimization that we are doing, and we're not conscious about that because that happens across different languages. So I'm not developing further on that. I have a few things we are asking about this. But essentially is that despite the variation you have in entropies and structure of language, there is an information theoretic quantification of this difference in entropies, which tells something about the linguistic order of words that is constant across different linguistic families. And my speculation, and what requires further research, is whether that's a cognitive constraint, and if it is, what sort of option is being put in into play here to actually find the balance. Okay? So essentially, guys, my talk. Thank you very much.